Parents lied about a medical emergency to steal my $15,000 wedding fund to fund golden child's honeymoon. So I married in secret and bankrupted them. Hey, so I 26F recently got married to my husband 26M after a 6-year-long relationship. We had an intimate ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which is not what we had in mind initially at all. I had actually wanted to get married on the beach because that's where some of our happiest memories are. My husband and I are both water babies and would make a trip to the beach at least once a month to unwind and let loose. So it's a special place for us. And I have even started looking for hotels where we could all stay, like literally any other bride on this planet. I wanted my wedding to be special, and I had even been saving money to have a huge celebration for the last 5 years. I work in advertising and I get paid decently, but my husband and I used to live modestly and try our best to save money for the future. We had been planning to book one of the best hotels with a sea-facing view so our guests could really have a fantastic time. And it was meant to be a luxurious experience, but we had to change our plans and scaled down considerably because my parents decided to borrow money from me a couple of months ago and I couldn't bring myself to decline. Some context here. My brother 24M also got married a couple of months ago, but it had been sudden for him and they didn't plan much. He had been with his wife for about 2 years and he had proposed to her just a month before they got married. It was a really small ceremony with just family and a few friends, but I was happy for him since it was their wedding, their choice. But a few weeks after the wedding, my mother reached out to me and asked to borrow $15,000. She told me that my father had fallen ill all of a sudden and said that it was probably his diabetes that was acting up again. But she couldn't bear all the medical expenses by herself, and she needed me to help her. She told me that there was a special drug that the doctors had suggested, but it cost a lot of money since it had to be imported and she couldn't afford it because their insurance didn't cover this. I was really concerned for my father's health, so I decided to step up and lend her the money. No questions asked. I paid him a couple of visits and asked my mother to show me the medical report several times, but she always managed to evade those questions. Whenever I would visit them, my dad was always in bed, but for some reason, he just didn't appear very sick. Even when I asked my mother why he hadn't been moved to the hospital so he could be observed and kept under professional care, she told me that it wasn't necessary at the moment, but somehow he was sick enough to need to be administered an uncommon drug that they didn't produce here, and it wasn't even covered by their insurance. I'm not an idiot. After the first few visits, I had figured out that something very fishy was going on with my parent, but I didn't want to accuse them of anything before I was sure it would be a really bad look for me if I accused them of lying to me about a medical emergency just to borrow money. And then it all turned out to be true after all. I realized that my brother hadn't been visiting our parents, and even when I would ask them why he wasn't there, my father would tell me that they didn't want him to worry because he was just so young and they wanted him to be focused on his work. And yet they were fine with me being worried sick about them. I did speak to my brother about it on a phone call after a couple of weeks had passed, and he still hadn't visited our father. He told me that he would drop by as soon as he came back from his honeymoon. That was news to me because I had no idea that he had already left for his honeymoon because my parents hadn't told me. And neither he nor his wife had posted about this on their social media either. So I had no clue where he was. When I asked him why he hadn't told me, he said that he had been planning to surprise everybody by coming back after a month of being MIA, with a bunch of photos, stories, and memories from their trip around Europe. He said that he had no intention of telling me either, but he had been quite concerned when I said that our father was sick, which is why he found it necessary to reply to me. He told me that he had spoken to our parents after he received my alarming text, but they had told him that he had nothing to worry about, and they were doing just fine here. He told me that our parents had probably just exaggerated the situation while talking to me, and I had believed it because I was kind of neurotic, which had led to a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt by forcing myself to believe that maybe they had been hiding the truth from my brother because they didn't want to ruin his honeymoon or get him all worried about them. Because I knew what I had seen at my parents' house, and there had been no scope for misunderstanding. But then my brother mentioned to me that he would have felt really guilty about not being there for Dad if what I had said about him being very sick turned out to be true, because apparently our parents were the ones funding his insanely expensive and long honeymoon. All the warning bells started going off in my head, so I asked him exactly how much was this trip going to cost him. And then he told me that this trip was going to cost our parents at least least 12–15K because he and his wife were pulling out all the stops and really making the most of their honeymoon by living in the most expensive hotels and eating at the best restaurants because they can only do this once. They would also be shopping for a lot of stuff, and even that was going to be covered by our parents. I knew instantly that this was where my money was going, and there was no medical emergency at all. There never had been any emergency to speak of, and that's why they had no documents to show me. And I'd never even been at the hospital. My parents had just invented that whole story because they wanted the money to fund my brother's honeymoon, and that was supposed to be their wedding gift. I felt extremely betrayed while hearing my brother brag about how our parents were going above and beyond for him, just so the two of them could enjoy their honeymoon since they hadn't been able to have a grand wedding. The money that I lent to my parents was from my wedding fund, and I felt like I had been stabbed in the back when I realized that my parents had given it all away to my brother. When I confronted them after that phone call, my parents told me that they had to cook up some story because they knew that I wouldn't give them the money if I knew that this was going to be used by my brother for his honeymoon. They told me that he had been struggling at work and had been down in the dumps for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without having to worry about money. Unfortunately, they couldn't fund it themselves because that would endanger their own retirement fund, and so they had to borrow money from me. Their reasoning was that I was still young and earning and had a lot of years ahead of me where I could work and earn this money back. But it was not the same for them. They also said that it was just money and they would return it at some point. But for now, I just needed to put myself second and think about my brother's feelings because this honeymoon had apparently rejuvenated him and rescued him from getting depressed. I couldn't believe it because this meant that I would have to cut down on my wedding expenses for no reason. Just to be clear, I had been okay with the idea of having a smaller wedding as long as it meant that my father's health wouldn't suffer. But this was not something that I had signed up for. I was furious once they told me the truth, and I told them that they had to pay me back before I got married because I wanted to use this money for my wedding. I had a lot of expenses to think of if I wanted to go through with a beach wedding. And even though my husband and his family were covering some of the expenses, I had to look out for myself as well. My parents paying for the wedding had never been on the cards since. They had told me very early on that they could either pay for me to go to college or they could pay for when I got married, but they couldn't afford both. I had decided that I was going to college and would pay for my wedding on my own, which is why I've been saving up for my wedding myself. In case any of you guys are wondering, when my brother started college, I did ask him if my parents had made him choose between these two as well, and he had left in my face as if this was the most ridiculous idea ever. I never brought that up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favorite, even though it was very clear that they did have one. But I was young and I still needed their help because I hadn't found a job at the time. So bringing these things up and fighting with them over it would only make the situation worse for me. And it didn't make sense to confront them about it. But it did come up several years later when I confronted them about the money that they had taken from me and how they had always favored my brother over me. They tried to deny it, but it was as clear as day, and I told them that they had to pay me back because I wasn't going to give up my dream wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My husband was there with me through all of this, and even though he tried to understand their perspective at first, he told me that they were being incredibly selfish by doing what they did, and they had literally no excuse for making up a story just so they could get my money. He said that he wasn't going to pressure me into anything, but I should reconsider my relationship with my parents because they clearly didn't care about me at all. I was still in shock because I didn't think that my parents would go so far as to lie to me about a medical emergency just to steal my money for my brother's honeymoon. I told my husband that I would probably just go no contact with them for a while because I couldn't take it anymore. After that, my parents started avoiding me, and my father still wasn't visiting the hospital because they had to make me believe that he was actually ill and they were using this money for the treatment. My brother had returned from his honeymoon and he wanted to throw a party for his friends, so he invited everyone, including our parents and me. I didn't want to go because I would see my parents there, and I didn't want to put up with their presence and behave like I was okay with everything that was happening. But I decided to go anyway because I needed to show my brother that I was really happy for him. When I got there, I found out that my brother had gifted his wife a brand new car. She had apparently been wanting to buy this for a long time, but they couldn't afford it. So my brother had decided to surprise her by using the money that our parents had given him. He made a speech about how grateful he was for our parents because they had been so kind to fund his honeymoon. He said that he was really thankful to them because he knew that they had to sacrifice their own wants and needs just so he could have a good time. He said that he would always remember this kind gesture from them. I felt disgusted by everything that was happening, and I just wanted to leave because there was no point in being there. My parents, of course, had the audacity to give me dirty looks the whole time and pretended like I was the one who had wronged them in some way. I left after a while, and then they didn't even contact me after that. It was my wedding day before I heard from them again. The wedding was supposed to be in a couple of weeks, and I wanted my parents to transfer the money back to my account so I could make all the payments. And I called my mom up to ask if they were going to return my money, but she kept avoiding me. Finally, I told them that if they didn't return my money before the wedding, I would take action against them, and it would involve them getting into some kind of trouble. They told me that I was being dramatic about the whole thing and they didn't have the money at the moment because they were struggling with their own finances. I had no idea what to do because I wanted to have my dream wedding, but I just didn't have enough money anymore. When I told my husband, he said that we could still scale down and have the wedding at his aunt's farmhouse property, which was really beautiful, but it was just not the beach. I did agree with him because I didn't want to delay the wedding anymore. We had waited for a long time, and it was time to get married. The ceremony was beautiful, and even though my parents showed up, I didn't really care about them. I was just glad to be married to the love of my life. Then we got married, and it was just beautiful. We had planned a smaller honeymoon for us because we had to save up for it again, and we couldn't afford to be extravagant anymore. But my husband had secretly hired an investigator to dig into my parents' finances because he didn't believe that they were struggling at all. When we got the report, I was horrified to learn that my parents had actually lied about the whole thing, and they did, in fact, have the money that they owed me. But they had simply refused to return it because they didn't think it was necessary. They had already spent a lot of it on my brother, but the investigator found out that my father had been lying to his friends about me being a bad daughter and not giving him enough money for his illness, which was why they were struggling to make ends meet. My husband was furious after learning about this, and he wanted to do something about it because he just couldn't take it anymore. When I told him that I was done with them, but he said that he couldn't let it go, so he reached out to their friends and told them the truth about what had happened. They didn't believe him at first, but then he showed them the receipts and bank statements and everything that he could get his hands on. Once they realized the truth, they began calling my parents out, and it became a huge deal. They had to pay the money back because they were now being shunned by their friend. They did transfer the money back to me after that, but I cut them off after that because I couldn't stand the sight of them anymore. It had taken me a long time to get over this because it wasn't just about the money. They had betrayed me and chosen my brother over me repeatedly, and this was just the final straw. My husband did tell me that we had to file a complaint with the police about everything that had happened, but I decided not to take that route because I wanted to be done with my parents once and for all. This happened a few months ago, but I haven't spoken to them since.